This morning, the crisis at our border. Tens of thousands of immigrants are trapped in the triangle in a desperate effort to flee to the U.S. Pix 11's Cristian Benavides is just back from his visit to the region, and his first-hand reports will explain why so many are running for their lives.
Now, from 42nd and 2nd, this is Pix 11 News Close-Up with Marvin Scott.
Good morning. It's a humanitarian crisis of intensifying magnitude. Tens of thousands of people, men, women, children, they're caught in the grips of violence and poverty in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. They're trapped in the northern triangle of Central America. In waves of caravans, they're attempting to escape and seek protection and asylum here in the United States. To better understand the plight of these immigrants, Pix 11 reporter Cristian Benavides joined a group from the Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of New York on a fact-finding mission to the region. I'm pleased to have Cristian join us this morning, along with Monsignor Kevin Sullivan. He's the Executive Director of Catholic Charities here in New York. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for joining us. This is a very serious crisis that we're dealing. I want to get to your graphic report in a moment, Cristian, but first let me ask you, Monsignor, what was the purpose of your mission, and do you feel that you achieved what you were seeking?
I do feel we achieved what we sought. Our purpose was to learn the reality, because there's a lot of rumors, there's a lot of stories, there's a lot of rhetoric, and a lot of it is focused at the border between Texas, Arizona, the United States, but we wanted to get beyond the border.
And you talked about the reality. What was the reality you found?
The reality we found was that there is pervasive poverty, there is pervasive violence, there is a lack of confidence in local government to deal with both questions of violence and of poverty, and people don't want to migrate to the United States is what we learned. We learned that they are forced and driven because they don't feel they have any other choice. So I think we got down to see in a very detailed, granular way some of the issues that are broad, and I think it was successful because we talked with so many different groups of people that I think we got, in our 5 days there, a pretty good perspective. Not perfect, but a good perspective of what's going on.
Let's get more into that a little later,
Sure.
But really, Cristian, you really got into the heart of the whole matter in Honduras. Violence prevails. Those 3 countries you visited are among the 5 most dangerous countries in the entire world. What did you find in Honduras?
That's right, Marvin. Particularly in Honduras, we went to a neighborhood. The name is Chamelecon, and when you're there, you realize how many families have been driven out of these neighborhoods. You go around, we went on a ride along with police, and as we rode along the neighborhood, you saw empty houses everywhere. And it's because gangs go to these houses. They tell the families, hey, listen, you have 24 hours to get out, and if you don't, you'll get killed.
They're forcing them out.
Oh, they're forcing them out.
The death rate is incredible.
Yeah. I believe in January, February, over 500 people. And Honduras is about the size, the population size is about the same as New York City. So you think about 500 murders in 2 months. If we saw something like that in New York City, that's what that would compare to.
I saw a figure of 8,000 crime-related deaths in Honduras last year in a country of 8.5 million. Incredible. Let's take a look at this report because that tells us a lot. Let's take a look at Cristian's report.
Here is the line that divides the territory controlled by 18th Street Gang and MS-13 inside of the Chamelecon neighborhood of San Pedro Sula in Honduras. The military stands guard at the entrance of the neighborhood. They call it a conflict zone. They stop and search vehicles for contraband and fugitives.
Era territorio de la Mara 18.
3 years ago, this was 18th Street territory, but there was a war. Inspector Josue Aroca of the National Police told us. At 23 years old, he is in charge of officers inside what many consider the most dangerous neighborhood in Honduras. In January and February alone, there have been 529 homicides inside of Honduras, a country with a population about the same size as New York City, just over 9 million.
All this graffiti that is now MS-13,
used to be 18th Street Gang. This graffiti is about 3 years old, according to police and an expert that interprets all of this. And what we understand now is that MS-13 won the war right here, so they control this part of the neighborhood.
We rode along with police in the middle of the day inside what used to be a residential area. It remains desolate and with abandoned homes lining the streets. Many of the families who were forced out are part of the estimated 100,000 migrants who have reached the U.S. southern border in the past year.
Los pandilleros la corrieron, la sacaron de aquí.
Threatened with execution, Inspector Aroca tells us residents were given 24 hours to pack their belongings so gang members can take over. Often the houses get turned into casas locas, or crazy houses. Here is one of them, places where murder was part of a daily routine.
National police here in Honduras arrested 9 members of the 18th Street Gang inside of this abandoned property. What they tell us is that the gang members mutilated and tortured a bus driver simply because he was a bus driver in MS-13 territory.
Gangs have owned this neighborhood ever since they executed more than 24 people, including 7 children, on the night before Christmas Eve in 2004. Today, a mural is there to remember the victims. The area still a kind of lockdown, with gates, concrete walls, and barbed wire in the middle of it all, an outreach center for at-risk youth who often have only 2 choices: join a gang or get killed. It's a safe haven for this 19-year-old who used to live in New York as well as Florida. He was recently deported back to Honduras and asked us not to use his name.
So if you were walking down the street and they saw you dressed in a way that they didn't like, would it be something that they would attack you for?
Yeah, because I'm not from that part. I'm not from that city.
We visited the center along with a New York delegation on a fact-finding mission to Central America.
We saw 90 kids who now have a future because they were being trained for jobs. They were being trained in self-esteem. They were learning values.
But less than a mile away sits another option for freedom: the San Pedro Sula bus terminal, the starting point for the migrant caravans, and for so many, their only way out.
Very, very few options. Join a gang or get killed. I saw a figure that 95% of the murders there go unsolved or simply never prosecuted. Why are the government so powerless to do anything?
Well, it all has to do with how much police officers are paid, right? Police officers don't have a salary that will allow them to live in a neighborhood that is not controlled by gangs.
So they're part of it.
Well, not because they want to be a part of it, but rather because they're out policing on the streets, then they come home at night, and just imagine if they live in one of these neighborhoods and a gang member comes to his home and tells him, hey, listen, you have 24 hours to leave, and as a police officer, you are so powerless to do anything.
Monsignor, this crisis, it didn't develop overnight. What's the origin of it?
The origin, in some ways, what people suggest is that the origin was actually in Los Angeles, at least the gang version of that these gangs got their origin on the streets of Los Angeles and in some of the jails in Los Angeles, and then kind of were transported back. So one of the things I took away from this trip is that this is an American problem. Not a problem of the United States at the border, not a problem of Central America, not a problem of South America, but it's an American problem. And together, we have to address the multiple causes and realities that is causing the migration, which we all focus on the border. But we got to solve this thing together.
Okay, let's take a break. Have more of your amazing reports from the region. Stay with us as Pix 11 News Close-Up continues, Trapped in the Triangle. Back now with Monsignor Kevin Sullivan of Catholic Charities and my colleague Cristian Benavides. They're just back from a fact-finding mission in the Northern Triangle. And we were talking about the violence that is driving these caravans seeking asylum here in the U.S. And violence is one of the overriding factors that's driving them from their homes. But it's more than that. It's climate change is also, particularly as you found out in El Salvador.
Yeah, in El Salvador, we were very fortunate to have a part of our trip to go to the rural area of El Salvador, not too far away from the Guatemalan border, arranged by Catholic Relief Services, to meet with some of the farmers there. And in the midst of the droughts, the crisis, the volatility of prices, which is driving people off the land, you know, there was a glimpse of hope. Because in the midst of the awfulness, people are trying. They haven't given up, trying to do the best they can in that situation. And we saw some intriguing, now I'm not a farmer, but some intriguing attempts to deal with irrigation and the drought so that crops could be more productive. So awful, it's not merely violence, it's the droughts, it's all of that coming together to create the crisis.
And you on the ground, you spoke to those farmers.
Yeah, we spoke to the farmers. I think what we found so surprising is that none of them have this idea of coming to the United States and wanting to migrate over here. The thing that makes them migrate is the fact that there is no work for them. And that's what we found. And we're going to see that right now in our report from El Salvador.
Night has fallen in the capital of El Salvador, and we are riding along with the National Police under the cover of darkness as they go out on patrol.
You like your job?
Yeah, I like it because, you know, you help people. You help people here. But at the same time, in this country, it's dangerous.
Officer William Saldivar, full-time officer and college student, has been on the job for only 2 years.
What goes through your mind? I mean, do you think that any night you could get killed out on the streets?
Yeah, it could happen in every time, you know. Now I have the uniform, but when I get my shift off, I have to take off my uniform.
Officer Saldivar patrols the streets wearing a uniform that's gotten 10 officers killed so far in 2019. The year before, 32 officers lost their lives in a country with the same population size as the state of Maryland. Gang members follow police officers after their shift to catch them off guard. For them, it's not just about killing their victims, but it's also about the way they kill.
Maybe once a week, maybe daily.
You're saying up to once a week you can hear of somebody getting decapitated.
Yeah.
This local pastor, who won't give us his real name, you'll understand why in a moment, knows a lot about how gang members kill. He used to be one of them, a member of MS-13. Now, a self-proclaimed evangelical Christian, hoping to help kids leave gang life behind. We met him at his church at the Las Palmas neighborhood. I would say about 15, he tells me, about the number of people he has killed. He started participating in homicides when he was just 8 years old. He tells me most of his victims were rival gang members and specific hits he was ordered to do. There's still hope for gang members, he tells me, to turn their life around, repent, and through religion, start anew. This is the violence pushing Salvadorans to the north. But that's not the only factor forcing people from their country. About 300 miles away, droughts have been affecting local crops, which means fewer jobs in rural communities. The last 3 years have been critical. Francisco Cázares tells me he is in charge of a number of fields that have implemented new measures to battle what he calls a dramatic change in climate.
This is one of the large farm fields that is here in the El Zunca neighborhood of El Salvador. As you can see, this is a pretty large field. There are a lot of farm workers right here. What they've told us is that they don't want to leave their communities. As long as there is work here, they will stay here. But climate change is starting to force some of them to migrate.
We visited the area along with a New York delegation on a fact-finding mission to Central America, here to understand why people are fleeing to the U.S. border.
The impact of climate change, is creating a drought situation, more extreme weather, a drier season more opportunity for pests that can destroy crops to thrive.
36-year-old Wilfredo Martinez has worked on the field since he was 11, where his father and grandfather also worked.
Muchos queremos trabajar, ¿verdad? Pero como no hay trabajo,
There are a lot of us who want to work, he tells me, but warns
los cultivos, en vez de mejorarse, se empeoran.
the crops aren't getting better, leaving farm workers looking for a way to survive. For many of them, that means the U.S.
In order to survive, but the problem is they simply can't get in. There are so many of them. How do we deal with that?
Well, it's so difficult, Marvin, because a lot of times when the migrants do finally reach the border, if they're a family unit, they might have a chance because they have a court date and they are released out on bail. But if it's not a family unit, you are stuck in a detention center for 2 to 3 years before you have your court date. And it's even difficult to even reach the U.S. border now because Mexico has started cracking down under pressure from the U.S. on the migrants. So now a lot of the migrants are actually stuck in Guatemala.
Now, Monsignor, you did say in Honduras, with the crisis there, you said you did get a sense of hope during your 5 days down there. Did you also get that sense of hope that there's going to be some positive change in El Salvador?
Yeah, as I talked about before, the fact that they're trying new stuff in this dry soil, they're trying sustainable water, they're trying new crops. Some of the kids we met had actually formed a business, a cafe in one of the kind of parks there where they had their own business. Now, Marvin, I don't want to say that this is a good situation, but I do think what we need to say is that hope is there, and that if together we worked on some of these projects, bringing them up a little bit closer to scale, that's what's going to deal with the migration issue if we can provide help, because people don't want to be forced to flee. So we look at the glimmers of hopes and say, how do we increase them? How do we make them, bring them up to scale?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that that's the main thing that, at least that I took away from it, is that people don't want to leave their homes. They want to stay there. The only reason that they leave is because they're being forced out. So the thought that they want to come over here and what some people think about migrants coming here, taking over our neighborhoods and something of that sort, that's not the case at all.
It's heartbreaking when we see the images of those families and the mothers clutching their babies and trying to get across the border. I think we lack that understanding that you provide in what you're telling us today and what you told us in those reports, Cristian, to better understand the plight of these people who are literally trapped in the Northern Triangle. Let's take a break. We come back, we'll talk about your next stop, which was Guatemala.
Guatemala.
We'll be
precisely.
right back. Stay with us as we continue our special report, Trapped in the Triangle. Back now with Monsignor Kevin Sullivan and my colleague Cristian Benavides talking about their fact-finding mission to the Northern Triangle and the crisis in Central America. We visited, we were in El Salvador, and we're also in El Salvador and Honduras, where we had the problem with violence, we had the problem with climate change, but it was a different situation when you got to Guatemala. In Guatemala, the problem there is poverty. 60% of the people there living below the poverty line. Cristian got the story right on the ground.
Just outside one of Guatemala's largest landfills sits an entire community. Each day, residents sift through piles of garbage, picking out anything of value, either to keep or to sell. There's a lot of them, says one of the on-duty managers. Severe poverty in Guatemala systematically pushing residents to join migrant caravans headed to the U.S. southern border. 60% of Guatemalans live below the poverty line, and 95% of them don't earn enough to provide for their family's basic needs. People who live in Guatemala say it's not as violent as its counterparts in the Northern Triangle. It also borders on Mexico, which makes it a strategic stop as migrants travel to the north.
This is Casa del Migrante. It's right here in the heart of Guatemala City. Now, not only does this place provide shelter, food, and clothing for migrants who are in danger, but it also helps them file for asylum in certain cases or they can't go back home because they'll be killed.
The shelter is built to house around 40 people at a time. Suseli Donis is a psychologist here. She tells me back in October, it was so packed with people, they had to turn the gymnasium into a place to sleep for close to 1,000 men, women, and children making their way to the United States. You feel powerless. They bring just one bag, she tells me, for a family of 5 that recently showed up at the center looking for refuge, their entire life packed into a single suitcase. We visited the center along with a New York delegation on a fact-finding mission about migration.
People have a sense that people are migrating to the United States in order to take advantage of us somehow, to take something away from us. That is not the case at all. They're coming to this country because they feel that they have no choice. Many of them are fleeing. Many of them feel if they stay where they are, they're going to be killed. Their families are going to be killed.
We met with one of the men staying at the center. He is in his late 50s and was deported from Los Angeles after living in the States for over 30 years. He tried to go back to his native country of El Salvador, but fled there because of the widespread violence.
A guy grabbed me from the shirt with a 9mm with a magazine loaded. He put it in my hand and said, "Get on your knees." They thought they killed me, because I passed out. And they rolled me in a blanket and went to throw me to a garbage. They robbed me everything. They beat me to death, but I'm alive. And I figured out that I cannot go back to El Salvador anymore.
He is now applying for asylum in Guatemala, hoping to eventually make it back to his family in LA. One of the hundreds of thousands of Central Americans who, whether it's due to poverty, violence, or even climate change, are looking to the U.S. just to stay alive.
And the U.S. has been helping for years, providing hundreds of millions of dollars to Guatemala and also to El Salvador and Honduras. But now there's talk of cutting off some of that aid to get those countries to stem those caravans coming towards our border. Is that only going to exacerbate it?
Marvin, any aid that is cut off is going to make things worse. Why? Because these organizations are the only way for many members of these communities to be able to get some job training, to be able to have a safe haven in the middle of all this gang violence. Or, people who are affected by climate change, there are organizations that are doing something about it down there. So if you are cutting off aid to them, it's only going to make more migrants come to the north.
But you were saying during the break, Monsignor, that there are people from that region who are now migrated to the United States who are also providing aid to the people who are still trapped there.
We have to recognize the connection between people in the United States and people in the Northern Triangle. The poverty in Guatemala would be incredibly less if it weren't over $11 billion a year that Guatemalans in the United States are sending back to help their family members that are there. There is the connection. The hope is if we can strengthen the connections and see us as North America, Central America, and together we can deal with the reality that is there. Not short term, but long term. That's our hope.
I want to end this by something you said early on in the first segment. You said that you did, in your fact-finding mission, you sensed hope.
Right.
There is hope for the future.
There is hope.
No easy solution, but there is hope.
No easy solution and no 1-second solution. But there is hope, and we need the perseverance to stick to what is working, bring it to scale long term.
Monsignor Kevin Sullivan and my colleague Cristian Benavides, congratulations on those excellent report. So enlightening and gives us some insight into what the situation is down there in the Northern Triangle.
Thank you, Marvin.
Thank you for joining us,
Thank
and that'll
you,
do it
Marvin.
for our program this week. I'm Marvin Scott. Thanks so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, everyone.